The first thing Sophie Bennett did after I offered her my bedroom was look past me at the bed and ask, "Which side is yours?" I had been expecting something normal, like thanks, or maybe an argument about whether I should really spend the night on my own couch. Instead, she stood in my doorway with one hand resting on the handle of her suitcase, glanced from the left side of the mattress to the right, and delivered the question with such a straight face that I almost respected the attempt. Almost. "Left," I said. Her mouth curved. "Good to know." I leaned against the doorframe. "Information only. It does not include company." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Wow, very strict accommodations. You arrived 40 minutes ago and already broke the guest room. Your ceiling broke itself. Don't blame the tourist." She smiled at me, and that was the exact moment I realized 3 nights with my best friend's sister had just become a much worse idea than it had sounded that morning. My name is Logan Parker. I was 32, and until that evening, Sophie had always existed in a very specific category in my life. She was Caleb's younger sister, although at 28 there was nothing particularly young about her except the way Caleb still talked about her. I had known him since college and met Sophie enough times over the years to develop what I considered a perfectly manageable attraction. Weddings, birthdays, group dinners, one chaotic 4th of July where she beat me badly at darts and reminded me about it for 2 years. We always got along. More accurately, she liked trying to get a reaction from me, and I liked pretending she rarely succeeded. What we had never done was spend meaningful time alone. So when Sophie called to say the hotel she had booked for her friend's engagement weekend had somehow lost her reservation, offering my guest room seemed harmless. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Seattle. She needed somewhere to stay for 3 nights. Caleb had even texted, "Appreciate it, man. Simple." It stayed simple for approximately 30 minutes. Sophie had barely opened her suitcase when she called my name from the guest room, and I found her staring at a dark patch spreading across the ceiling. A second later, a drop of water landed directly on the pillow. "That seems bad," she said. "Excellent research." I moved the bed away from the wet area, called the building's maintenance number, and learned that a pipe in the apartment above us had decided to become everybody's problem. The manager told me not to let anyone sleep in the room until they inspected the ceiling the next morning. Sophie crossed her arms while I ended the call. "I can find another hotel. At 8:30 on a Friday during festival weekend, I have apps. You have optimism." I pointed toward my bedroom. "Take mine. I'll use the couch." That was when she followed me down the hall, surveyed my bed, and asked which side belonged to me like we were discussing a reservation for 2. After I gave her the answer she clearly had not expected me to give, Sophie rolled her suitcase into the room and looked back at me. "You know, most guys would panicked. You asked a directional question. I asked which side of your bed you sleep on." "Left is still geographically accurate." She laughed and shook her head. "Caleb makes you sound much more dangerous. Your brother has known me for 14 years and has never once described me as dangerous." "Exactly. Suspicious. I should have left then." But Sophie was watching me with that particular amused expression I remembered from every group event where she had decided I was more entertaining than whatever else was happening. The difference was that this time no brother, friend, crowded table, or background conversation existed to absorb the attention. It was just her standing beside my bed and me being increasingly aware that I had voluntarily told an attractive woman where I slept. We ordered takeout because neither of us had eaten. By the time it arrived, Sophie had changed into jeans and a soft gray sweater, tied her hair up, and somehow made herself comfortable in my apartment without acting like she owned it. She sat on the kitchen counter while I divided noodles between 2 bowls and gave me a condensed version of the engagement weekend schedule. Brunch Saturday, party that evening, some kind of Sunday recovery breakfast for people who apparently believed 3 consecutive social events were relaxing. "And you're photographing anything this weekend?" she asked. I told her I had a short commercial shoot Saturday morning, but otherwise planned to edit from home. "So we're basically roommates," she said, "for 72 hours. That sounded like you were starting a countdown. I like measurable problems." Sophie took her bowl from me. "Am I a measurable problem?" I looked at her. "Data collection has just begun." She smiled into her noodles, and the conversation moved on, but the title question had changed something I could not reset. I noticed when she tucked one foot beneath her on the couch. I noticed when she leaned over to show me a photo from her friend's engagement, and her shoulder pressed briefly against mine. None of those things would have mattered much before, because attraction was easy to dismiss when we only saw each other in groups. Now every ordinary movement happened inside private space, and Sophie seemed perfectly aware of it. She did not constantly flirt. That would have been easier. Instead, she talked to me like someone genuinely interested in who I was when Caleb was not around to supply context. She asked about photography, why I had chosen Seattle, whether I actually enjoyed living alone or had simply become good at it. I asked about her research work, and she explained that half her job involved getting people to tell the truth about products they had just spent 10 minutes politely praising. "So professionally you make people uncomfortable until they become honest," I said. She pointed her fork at me. "Now you understand why I'm so good at vacations." Around 11, Sophie disappeared into my bedroom while I unfolded the couch. I had just finished convincing myself the sleeping arrangement was completely manageable when she came back out for water wearing loose sleep shorts and a faded college t-shirt. Nothing dramatic, nothing designed for effect, which somehow made my sudden interest in the couch cushions feel more ridiculous. She filled a glass at the sink, drank half of it, then looked toward the blanket I had laid out. "You're seriously sleeping there?" That was the plan. "Because I'm Caleb's sister?" I met her eyes. "Because you're my guest." Sophie set the glass down. "Very diplomatic, I have references." She walked a little closer, not enough to make the moment obviously intimate, but enough that I noticed. "Do you always behave this responsibly around women you like?" That one landed cleanly. I could have denied it, laughed, or reminded her that she was staying in my apartment because her brother trusted me. Instead, I looked at her and said, "Only the ones asking dangerous questions in my kitchen." Sophie's eyebrows lifted, and for the first time all evening I actually surprised her. Then her smile came back, slower than before. "Good night, Logan." "Good night, Sophie." She disappeared down the hall, leaving me with a couch that suddenly looked about 6 inches too short and a very clear understanding of the problem ahead. Giving Sophie my bed for one night was easy. Spending the next 3 days pretending her question had not changed what we were both allowed to notice was going to be considerably harder. I slept badly, which I blamed on the couch and not at all on the fact that Sophie Bennett was 20 feet away in my bed, after asking whether I always behaved responsibly around women I liked. By 7 the next morning, I had given up pretending sleep was still possible. I showered, changed, and walked into the kitchen expecting an empty apartment. Instead, Sophie stood barefoot in front of my coffee maker, wearing one of my charcoal hoodies over sleep shorts, staring at the machine like it had personally insulted her. She turned when she heard me. "Before you say anything," I was cold. I looked at the hoodie. "You opened my closet? Guest privileges. That is not a recognized category." She pulled the sleeves over her hands, then add a friend-sister surcharge. I reached past her to press the button she had apparently missed. "I'm trying to stop thinking of you that way." The words came out before I had time to decide whether I should say them. Sophie went still for half a second. "As your friend's sister?" "As somebody whose choices need to be approved through Caleb." I poured water into the machine and tried to look like I had not just said something significantly more intimate than coffee preparation required. "You're 28. You can steal your own hoodies." She looked down at herself. "This one is technically yours." "Exactly. Independent crime." A smile pulled slowly across her face. "Interesting morning. It's 7:15. You've already flirted with me and accused me of theft. Efficient scheduling." She laughed. And something about hearing it in my kitchen, before either of us had properly started the day, felt more personal than anything we had said the night before. We made breakfast from whatever I had in the refrigerator, which meant eggs, toast, and one avocado that Sophie examined like a medical specimen before declaring salvageable. She sat across from me at the small kitchen table, hair still messy from sleep, both hands around a mug. Without the audience of friends or the deliberate tension of the bedroom joke, conversation should have become easier. Instead, it became more honest. Sophie asked whether I had been surprised when she called me about staying here. "A little," I said. "Why me?" She took a sip of coffee and looked over the rim of the mug. "Because you had a guest room. Several people in Seattle have guest rooms. Not several people I trust." That answer already meant more than I expected, but she continued. "And I wanted to know what you were like without Caleb around." I leaned back slightly. "You make that sound like research. Occupational hazard. And what exactly were you testing?" Sophie smiled, but this time she did not answer immediately. "You're different when it's just you." "Better or worse?" "Less filtered." I laughed. "You asked which side of my bed I sleep on within an hour of arriving. That was me gathering baseline data. Very scientific." She broke off a piece of toast. "I've known you for years, Logan. But usually there are 6 other people around and my brother is telling the same college story for the 14th time." I was curious. "About me?" I asked. Sophie gave me a look. "Don't make me regret being honest before 8 in the morning." That was not exactly a confession, but it was enough to make the coffee suddenly more interesting than it deserved. I had a commercial shoot downtown that morning, while Sophie left for brunch with the engagement group. We separated for most of the day, which I was grateful for because it gave me time to determine whether 24 hours of proximity had turned me irrational. It had not. If anything, being away from her made the previous night easier to understand. I liked Sophie before she arrived. That part was not new. What was new was discovering how much I liked the quieter version of her, the woman who stole my hoodie and sat barefoot at my table, and admitted she had chosen my apartment partly because she was curious about me. By the time I finished shooting, I had stopped pretending the attraction was only a product of sharing space. Sophie texted around 9 that evening to say the engagement party had expanded into drinks and she would be late. I told her to have fun and assumed I would be asleep before she returned. Instead, at 11:20, I was on the couch editing photos when the front door opened and Sophie stepped inside carrying a paper takeout container and her heels in one hand. She had changed into a dark blue dress for the party, and her hair was pinned up loosely enough that several strands had escaped around her face. She looked tired, amused, and very pleased to find me awake. "You waited up. I was working." That sounded defensive. "You're projecting." She kicked the door shut gently behind her. "Excellent. Then you won't mind if I eat noodles beside your expensive equipment." She changed into comfortable clothes and returned with 2 forks, even though I had not said I was hungry. 10 minutes later, we were sharing spicy noodles from the container while she told me about the party. She was funny when describing people she liked because even the jokes carried affection. She imitated her friend's fiancé practicing a speech 3 times, and admitted she had nearly cried when her friend showed her the ring again, even though Sophie had already seen it in photos. At some point she shifted closer to show me a picture on her phone. Our shoulders touched. She finished explaining the photo, but she did not shift back. I noticed. Sophie noticed me noticing. Neither of us acknowledged it. Instead she asked, "Did you actually enjoy today?" I told her about the shoot and showed her a few unedited frames. Sophie studied them more seriously than I expected, asking why I had chosen certain angles and what I noticed first when I walked into a location. That turned into a conversation about what people reveal when they think nobody is paying attention. She told me that in her research work, the most useful answers often came after the interview officially ended, once people stopped trying to be helpful. "So everyone tells the truth when they think the important part is over," I said. Sophie glanced at me. "Sometimes." There was enough meaning in that one word to make me look back at her. Around midnight, she finally stood. "I should sleep before tomorrow turns into a human rights violation." I started gathering the takeout container. Sophie remained beside the couch, looking down at the blanket and pillow I had used the night before. "Is that actually comfortable?" "Absolutely." "Logan, no." "How bad?" I'm fairly sure my spine filed a complaint. She glanced toward the hallway. "You know there's an entire unused half of your mattress." I looked at her. Sophie's expression was calm but not careless. That sounded familiar. This time I'm making an observation. Dangerous habit. She walked backward toward the bedroom, one hand resting briefly against the hallway wall. "Good night." "Good night." Then she stopped and looked back. "For the record, the right side is still available." She disappeared into my room before I answered. I sat alone on the couch for several seconds, staring toward the hallway. The first night sleeping out there had felt obviously respectful. Now I was not as certain. Sophie had made her own position increasingly clear, and I was beginning to wonder whether refusing the empty half of my own bed was still about respecting a boundary, or whether I had started using Caleb as an excuse for a decision Sophie had never asked him to make. I stayed on the couch that second night, which would have been easier to call principled if I had not spent nearly an hour staring at the ceiling and thinking about the empty right side of my own bed. Sophie had not asked me to make a decision for her. She had not even asked me to touch her. She had simply made it clear that the possibility did not scare her, then left me to decide what I actually wanted, instead of what I thought Caleb would consider responsible. By morning, my back hurt, my pride was worse, and Sophie was already in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in. She took one look at me and said, "Wow, the couch won." I opened a cabinet. "Temporary tactical setback. You're limping. I'm 32. Sleeping furniture has consequences." She hid a smile behind her mug. "Good thing there's a mattress nearby." I had expected her to push harder after that. She did not, and somehow that made the invitation from the night before feel more serious. Sophie spent the morning getting ready for another engagement event while I edited photos at the kitchen table. She moved through the apartment comfortably now, leaving her makeup bag beside the bathroom sink and charging her phone from an outlet near the couch without asking first. Nothing about it felt invasive. It felt surprisingly natural, which was more dangerous. Before she left, she stopped behind my chair to look at the images on my screen. "You make empty restaurants look romantic," she said. "Occupational deception, so you could probably make me look sophisticated." I glanced up at her. "That would require heavier editing." She smacked my shoulder lightly and laughed, but when she headed for the door she looked back and said, "I'm free for a few hours this afternoon if you are." This time there was no loaded joke around the invitation. I told her I was. We met near a neighborhood market after her brunch ended, and the next few hours removed another excuse I had been using. Until then, I could still tell myself that some of the intensity came from having Sophie inside my apartment, where every hallway and couch suddenly carried more meaning than it should. But outside, surrounded by families, tourists, produce stands, and enough noise to kill any artificial intimacy, I liked her exactly as much. She stopped at every food stall offering samples, challenged me to photograph the ugliest handmade mug she could find, and somehow convinced an elderly vendor to explain the difference between 6 varieties of honey while I stood beside her, pretending not to enjoy how easily she drew people in. At one point, she caught me watching her negotiate over a ridiculous ceramic bowl. "There," she said. "That look again." "What look?" "The one where you're clearly thinking something and then deciding whether it's responsible." Maybe I was thinking the bowl is overpriced. She stepped closer. "You're getting better at flirting, but your recovery still needs work," I smiled. "Maybe I'm not recovering." That stopped her for half a beat. Sophie's expression changed from teasing to surprised, then pleased. "There he is." "Who?" "The version of Logan who actually responds instead of standing there like I'm throwing tennis balls at a wall." "That is an unfair description. You've caught every single ball. Occupational reflexes." She laughed and bumped her shoulder against mine as we kept walking. I did not need to analyze what the exchange meant. I had flirted because I wanted to. She had enjoyed it because she wanted me to, and neither of us had invoked her brother once. By the time we returned to my apartment that evening, the old boundary already felt less like a rule and more like something we had inherited without checking whether either of us still agreed with it. The building manager was waiting outside my door. He had inspected the guest room while we were gone and explained that the damaged section of ceiling needed to dry before repairs could begin Monday. Nobody should sleep there for the rest of the weekend. Sophie thanked him, then waited until he disappeared down the hallway before looking at me. Well, I unlocked the door. "Don't," I didn't say anything. "Your face did." My face asked a practical question. We stepped inside and I put my keys on the counter. For once, though, I did not offer the couch immediately. The whole point of what had bothered me the night before was that I kept announcing boundaries before Sophie had any part in defining them. So I turned toward her and said, "I need to ask you something without deciding the answer for you first." Sophie leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly more attentive. "Okay," I took a breath. "If you genuinely want me in the bedroom tonight, I'll sleep there. But I don't want us pretending it's because the couch is bad or because there's technically half a mattress available." Her teasing expression disappeared, not because she was uncomfortable, but because I'd finally stopped giving her something playful to hide behind. "I do want you there," she said. The simplicity of it hit harder than any of her suggestive lines. She looked down briefly, then back at me. "And I'm attracted to you, obviously. I'm pretty sure I lost plausible deniability around which side is yours." I smiled, but she continued before I could interrupt. "I just don't want us to wake up tomorrow and act like we accidentally did something because I was visiting and the ceiling leaked. I don't want that either." I moved closer, leaving enough distance that the next part still belonged to both of us. "Then we share the bed. That doesn't mean anything else has to happen." Sophie studied me for a moment. "You're saying that because you actually want the boundary, right? Not because Caleb might materialize through the wall? I'm saying it because I want whatever happens between us to be something we both choose while we're fully aware we're choosing it." Her smile returned, smaller and warmer. "Annoyingly reasonable. It's a gift. Fine. Shared bed. No assumptions." She held out her hand like we were negotiating a contract. I shook it. "Agreed." Sophie kept hold of my hand for an extra second before releasing it. For the record, I still get the right side. That was never disputed. Going to bed beside Sophie turned out to be significantly harder than discussing it. We brushed our teeth at the same sink, argued about whether the room was too warm, and climbed beneath the covers with the careful normality of two people who were both extremely aware that nothing about this felt normal. I stayed on my side. Sophie stayed on hers. For several minutes we talked in the dark about pointless things because pointless things were safer, including the engagement party, the terrible ceramic bowl she had almost bought, and whether I actually owned enough black t-shirts to qualify for a photographer stereotype. Then the conversation faded. I could hear the soft movement of her breathing beside me and feel the warmth of another person only a couple feet away. "Sophie?" I said quietly. "Yeah, still okay?" There was a small pause. Very. A few seconds later, her hand moved across the space between us until her fingers found mine on top of the blanket. She did not tug me closer or turn it into a challenge. She simply laced her fingers through mine. I squeezed once and let our hands stay there between us. That was all, and somehow it felt more intimate than anything else we had done. The boundary between us was no longer Caleb's, no longer an accident of a broken guest room, and no longer something I was defining alone. It belonged to Sophie and me now. Lying beside her with her hand in mine, I remembered that tomorrow would be her last full day in Seattle, and for the first time I understood that doing nothing had become just as much of a choice as doing something. I woke before Sophie the next morning with her hand still loosely wrapped around mine. At some point during the night, the careful distance between us had narrowed, not dramatically, but enough that her shoulder rested against my upper arm and one of her knees had crossed the invisible line down the center of the mattress. I stayed still for a minute, listening to the quiet apartment and trying not to turn an ordinary sleeping position into evidence of anything. Then Sophie opened one eye. "You're thinking too loudly," I smiled. "I didn't know that was measurable. I'm a researcher. Everything is measurable." She glanced at our joined hands, then up at me. "Still okay?" "Very." Her expression softened, and instead of making a joke, she squeezed my fingers once before letting go to stretch. The morning could have become awkward, but neither of us allowed it to. Sophie stole the bathroom first. I made coffee, and by the time she appeared in the kitchen, we were arguing about whether toast counted as breakfast if nothing interesting was on it. Still, something had shifted. She brushed past me to reach a mug, and neither of us pretended not to notice the contact. When I handed her coffee, her fingers lingered against mine. There was no need to manufacture tension anymore because we had both admitted it existed. The harder fact was sitting underneath everything else. Sophie was leaving the next morning. Caleb called while we were eating. Sophie looked at the screen, made a face, and answered on speaker only because her hands were covered in jam. He wanted to know whether she had survived the engagement weekend and whether my guest room had met what he called basic human standards. Sophie looked directly at me. The guest room tried to drown me. There was a pause. "What?" "Long story. Logan handled it." Caleb laughed. "Of course he did. That's why I sent you there." I felt the old category settle briefly over the kitchen again. Reliable friend, safe apartment, responsible guy Caleb trusted with his sister. The description was not wrong, but it suddenly felt incomplete enough to bother me. After the call, Sophie wiped her hands and watched me over her coffee. "You got quiet, just thinking. Dangerous." I smiled, but she kept looking. "Is this about Caleb?" I considered giving her the easy answer and decided we had already done enough of that. "A little. Not the way you probably think." I told her I was not worried that Caleb would forbid anything, because neither of us was 16 and he did not control her life. What bothered me was the possibility that I was allowing 3 unusual days to convince me of something that ordinary life might not support. "You're leaving tomorrow," I said. "The guest room broke. We've been around each other constantly, and everything is compressed. I don't want to confuse intensity with compatibility." Sophie nodded slowly. She did not look offended. "That's annoyingly I specialize in that. But for the record, I liked you before your ceiling became emotionally involved." She left around noon for the final engagement event, and for the first time since Friday, the apartment became completely quiet. I edited photographs for an hour, went for a run, showered, and still had too much time to think. What I eventually realized was that Sophie's departure did not make me want to retreat. It made me want evidence that we could continue once convenience disappeared. Sharing a bed had clarified the attraction, but attraction was the easy part now. I wanted to know whether she would still send me ridiculous observations when she was not sleeping 20 feet away, whether I would still look for reasons to hear her voice when she was back inside her regular life, and whether either of us was willing to do something inconvenient enough to find out. Sophie texted around 7 that the group was heading to another bar after dinner. I told her to have fun and meant it. 40 minutes later, my front door opened. She stepped inside wearing the same dark green dress she had left in, carrying her heels in one hand and looking far too pleased with herself. That was a short bar. I didn't go. I closed my laptop. "Everything okay? Everything's fine." She set her shoes down near the door. I wanted to come back here. There was no smirk after the sentence, no suggestive tone designed to give her an escape route. She simply said it and waited for me to understand what choosing the apartment over another night with her friends actually meant. I stood and walked toward her. "Because you're tired?" Sophie gave me a look. "Don't become stupid now. You've been doing so well," I laughed. And she came closer. "I leave tomorrow, Logan. I could spend tonight pretending that doesn't matter, but I don't want to." Her fingers played briefly with the strap of her purse before she set it down. "And I don't want this weekend to become some funny story we tell separately later. The ceiling leaked. We flirted too much. We shared a bed. End credits." She hesitated, and for once I could see the effort it took for her not to turn vulnerability into performance. "I pushed you because I was tired of wondering whether you only saw me as Caleb's sister. But I also don't want to become your 3-day exception. You're not." I said it too quickly to be strategic. Sophie's eyes stayed on mine. "Then what am I?" There it was, the question I could not answer responsibly with a kiss, a joke, or a promise manufactured because she had a flight the next day. I stepped closer until only a little space remained between us. "Someone I want to keep seeing after tomorrow." Her shoulders loosened slightly. "That sounds suspiciously straightforward. I've been practicing." She smiled, but I kept going. "I don't know exactly what this turns into yet, and I'm not going to pretend I do just because we're running out of weekend." But I know I don't want your flight to decide it for us. Sophie looked down for a second and then back up. So what are you proposing, Parker? That question I could answer with something concrete. I asked when she was free the following weekend. Sophie blinked. Seriously, you wanted a plan that exists after you leave, and naturally you respond with calendar management. It's one of my more seductive qualities. She laughed, but her eyes had gone bright. She told me she was free Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning. I had a shoot Saturday morning. Then I'll come to you Saturday evening, I said. Or you come here. We choose one before you leave tomorrow. After that, we choose the next one. No ceiling required. For a moment, Sophie just looked at me. Then she stepped into the remaining distance, caught the front of my shirt lightly in one hand, and said, "That may be the least cinematic thing anyone has ever said right before I wanted to kiss them." Who said anything about kissing? Her eyebrows lifted. Careful. I'm trying to improve my response time. She smiled and pulled me down the last few inches. Our first kiss was warm and deliberate, nothing like the accidental physical tension that had started in my bedroom doorway. My hand settled at her waist, and when she moved closer, I let her set the distance. The second kiss lasted longer because neither of us needed to wonder whether the first one had been a mistake. When we finally pulled apart, Sophie rested her forehead briefly against mine. One problem. What? Caleb. I exhaled a laugh. Of course. She leaned back enough to study me. What are you going to tell him? That question was different from asking whether I was afraid of him. Sophie was asking whether I still thought of whatever this was as something that needed to be excused through my friendship with her brother. I looked at the woman standing in front of me, the same woman who had arrived as my friend's visiting sister, and spent 3 days making that description increasingly useless. For the first time, I knew the answer mattered less because of what Caleb might say, and more because of what my answer would tell Sophie about whether I was prepared to own the choice we had just made. The answer to Sophie's question came more easily than I expected. I'll tell Caleb the truth, I said. She was still standing close enough that one of her hands rested against my chest, and I could feel the change in her posture before I saw it in her face. Which version, she asked. The one where his sister came to Seattle for an engagement weekend, destroyed my guest room through absolutely no fault of her own, took over half my closet, and somehow convinced me I want to keep seeing her. Sophie smiled. I took one hoodie. The investigation is ongoing. Her fingers curled lightly into my shirt. You're not asking him first? I shook my head. No, I care what he thinks because he's my friend and your brother, but I'm not asking him whether you're allowed to date me. Sophie studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. I could tell the answer mattered to her, but she did not turn it into some test I had passed. Instead, she kissed me once, smiled against my mouth, and said, "Now move, you promised me the left side." We shared the bed again that night, only this time the careful gap from the night before disappeared naturally. We talked until after midnight about everything except what Caleb might say, mostly because neither of us wanted to give him that much space in our last evening. Sophie told me about a disastrous research project where a focus group had spent 40 minutes arguing over the color of a button. I told her about photographing a hotel opening where the chef had accidentally set off the fire alarm during the ribbon cutting. Somewhere in the middle of laughing, she moved closer and rested her head against my shoulder. I put an arm around her, and the fact that it felt comfortable instead of dramatic told me more than another hour of analysis probably would have. We kissed again before sleeping, slower this time, but stopped there because neither of us needed to turn one weekend into a race toward every possible milestone. The next morning was quieter. Sophie's suitcase sat open on the bedroom floor, while she folded clothes with the kind of concentration people use when they are trying not to acknowledge that packing means leaving. I made eggs and coffee, then found her standing in the doorway wearing my hoodie again. That better be staying here, I said. She looked down at it. I thought we established guest privileges. Visit is ending, then consider it collateral. I handed her a mug. For what? Sophie took a drink. Future visits. That answer landed exactly where she intended. But this time neither of us needed to pretend it was only teasing. While we ate, we chose the following weekend. Sophie lived in Portland, close enough that seeing each other required effort without becoming a logistical campaign. I would drive down Saturday, after my morning shoot, stay at a hotel near her neighborhood, and let her choose dinner because she claimed Seattle had unfairly given me home field advantage. The plan was ordinary, specific, and maybe that was why I trusted it. When it was time to leave for the station, Sophie rolled her suitcase toward the door and then looked back at the hallway. You know, I never actually slept in your guest room. Technically, you spent about 20 minutes in there before the ceiling rejected you. Your apartment has strong opinions, apparently. She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around my waist. I'm going to miss you. There was no joke attached. I held her tighter. I'm going to miss you too. At the station, we kept the goodbye short enough not to make it worse. Sophie kissed me beside her suitcase, told me not to become weird during the 6 days between visits, and boarded before either of us could turn departure into a dramatic event. I watched the train leave, went home, and discovered that 3 days was apparently enough time for one person to change the sound of an apartment when she was no longer in it. Her water glass was still beside the sink. One hair tie sat near the bathroom mirror. The right side of my bed looked annoyingly untouched. I considered texting her immediately and decided I could survive the 15 minutes until she texted first. She lasted 9. "Your right side has terrible customer service," I replied. "Management is reviewing your complaint." I called Caleb that afternoon. I considered waiting until Sophie and I had seen each other again, but that felt too much like hoping the conversation would somehow become easier if I postponed it. He answered on the second ring and immediately asked whether his sister had survived my collapsing apartment. "She survived," I said. "We're also seeing each other." Silence lasted long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. Then Caleb said, "I'm sorry, what?" I repeated it without softening the wording. He asked when that had happened, and I told him enough of the story to make the situation clear without describing anything that belonged privately to Sophie and me. When I finished, Caleb exhaled slowly. "You know she's my sister. I'm aware. It came up once or twice." He was quiet again. But he was not angry so much as recalibrating 14 years of friendship in real time. "Are you serious about this?" he asked. I looked around my apartment at the repaired ceiling estimate sitting on the counter and Sophie's forgotten hair tie beside my keys. "Serious enough that I'm telling you, instead of hoping you find out later." Caleb muttered something I could not quite hear, then said, "If you hurt her, I reserve the right to be extremely irritating." "You've been extremely irritating since college." That finally got a laugh out of him. I did not ask for permission, and he did not pretend he had any to give. By the time we hung up, nothing about my friendship with Caleb had magically become simpler, but nothing had exploded either. It was simply one more relationship adjusting to a choice Sophie and I had already made. The next several weeks gave us the answer I had wanted before she left. The connection survived ordinary life. I drove to Portland. Sophie came back to Seattle. We talked during boring commutes, occasionally annoyed each other, discovered that she hated how early I liked to plan weekend breakfasts, and learned that I became irrationally competitive at trivia. There were no leaking ceilings forcing us together and no engagement weekend compressing everything into 3 days. We still chose the calls, the drives, the dinners, and the time. That was enough. About 6 weeks later, Sophie came to Seattle on a Friday evening and found me standing proudly in the repaired guest room. New drywall, fresh paint, clean sheets, no visible threat of indoor weather. "Look at that," I said. "Functional accommodations." Sophie stepped inside and inspected the ceiling with exaggerated seriousness. "Impressive. You finally have a guest room." She turned slowly, looked at the perfectly good bed, then glanced down the hallway toward my bedroom. The smile arrived before the question. "Which side is yours?" I laughed because I knew exactly what she was doing and because the answer meant something completely different now. "Left." I walked closer. "And if you want the right side, it's yours." Sophie held my gaze for a second, then picked up her overnight bag and carried it straight past the guest bed. "Good," she said. "I hate unpacking twice." That weekend, the guest room stayed empty by choice instead of circumstance. I think that was the part I remembered most. Not because sharing a bed was some grand proof of anything, but because neither of us needed a broken ceiling, a brother's approval, or a provocative joke to explain why we were there anymore. Sophie had arrived in my life as my friend's visiting sister. She stayed because we both decided that description was no longer enough.
And when I look back at everything that happened, the strange part is how little of it began with some grand romantic decision. Sophie came to Seattle because a hotel lost her reservation, and I offered her the guest room because that was what a longtime friend would do for his best friend's sister. Then the ceiling leaked, the guest room became unusable, and a practical sleeping arrangement suddenly forced both of us to notice a tension we had been able to ignore for years. Her asking which side of my bed was mine was funny on the surface, but it also made the real question impossible to miss. Were we still going to treat each other according to a category Caleb had created for us? Or were we going to decide for ourselves what this connection actually was? What followed mattered because neither of us rushed straight from attraction into pretending we had an answer. We spent time together outside the apartment, talked without Caleb or a group around, and discovered that the chemistry was not just a product of being stuck under one roof. Sophie admitted she had chosen to stay with me, partly because she was curious about who I was without her brother there, and I finally admitted that I wanted to stop treating her like someone whose choices had to be filtered through Caleb. Even when the guest room stayed unavailable, sharing the bed was not treated as permission for anything else. We talked about the boundary directly, agreed on it together, and let the closeness develop without turning the weekend into something neither of us had chosen. The bigger turning point came when Sophie's departure stopped being a reason to keep things safely temporary. She told me she did not want to become a 3-day exception, and that forced me to answer the part that mattered beyond the visit. Instead of making a dramatic promise, we made an ordinary plan for the following weekend. That was important because it gave the relationship somewhere to exist after the broken ceiling, the engagement events, and the compressed intensity of the trip were gone. Caleb still mattered, but not as an authority over Sophie. I told him because he was my best friend and her brother, not because Sophie needed his permission to date me. He needed a moment to adjust, but the friendship survived, and more importantly, Sophie and I kept choosing each other after normal life returned. The drives between Seattle and Portland, the calls, the weekends, and the small differences between us gave us the evidence we had wanted. 6 weeks later, when the repaired guest room was finally available, Sophie walked right past it. By then, the right side of my bed was no longer a provocative joke or a consequence of bad plumbing. It was simply a place we had both chosen. That is what makes this story more interesting than the usual idea of crossing a forbidden line with a friend's sibling. The line was never truly forbidden. Logan had treated it that way because the label Caleb's sister made caution feel like responsibility. But Sophie kept reminding him that she was an adult with her own agency. The healthiest moment was not the first kiss. It was the conversation before they shared the bed, when Logan stopped deciding what was appropriate on her behalf and asked what she actually wanted. That shifted the boundary from something inherited from Caleb into something Sophie and Logan could define together. There is also a useful difference between chemistry and pressure in the way they handled the weekend. They were attracted to each other, they had limited time, and circumstances had made the apartment unusually intimate, but neither of them used that urgency as proof that they needed to move faster. In fact, the most convincing sign that the connection was real came from what they planned after Sophie left. A scheduled visit, a drive to another city, and continued effort are much less cinematic than a leaking ceiling, but they are much stronger evidence of intention. And Caleb's role matters for the same reason. Logan respected the friendship enough to tell him, but he did not turn Caleb into a gatekeeper. That balance is what kept the story from becoming either secretive or performative. Sophie was not a risk to manage. She was a person Logan had to choose directly. So here is the part I am curious about. If someone had been in your life for years under the label of my friend's sibling, what would have to change before you were willing to see them differently? Share your take below, especially whether Logan waited too long or handled the boundary the right way. If this kind of slow burn story is your thing, a like and a subscription help me know to keep bringing you more of them.